certainly for me, it's about, well, I guess I want to grab from your research is about those particular messaging, I guess, techniques as to what will give them the best messaging that's straight to the point, it's easy to understand, and it's just, I guess, points as to what you need to do. So it's not convoluted, it's not hard for them to understand. There's messaging around that bushfire sort of stuff at the moment that is understood by the agencies, the response agencies, but for the layman person, and even myself sometimes, they'll be saying things and you just go, I actually don't quite understand what you're asking me to do. I don't understand, the language you're using in regard to that. And it's everyday language for them, but for the common person in the community, they don't understand that. So for me, it's about, I guess, gauging from your research, what is the best, I guess, language to use that's not going to cause panic, but it's going to give a very strong directive to public at these certain points. When you hear this, you need to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. So we took very much a community-oriented approach when we were examining existing warnings, and then use principles from basic language and also signalling, how we're signalling risk and signalling responses to really reconstruct the message format. One of the early observations from us, but also when we did national focus groups, was there's a very strong technical and operational orientation to the messages, so geared around levels of warnings and using that as the lead, or having warnings that were initially meant for media but the same kind of warning structure as what's presented to a community member. So the first kind of few lines that they read aren't actually relevant for them, but it actually sets off the tone in a confusing approach. So it's cutting out that and starting, our approach is to start and lead with a behaviour that we want people to do, which has been translated into the calls to action statement as part of the Australian warning system. The view behind that is when you start with an action, you are removing any doubt or any information processing burden or educational burden that you have to, as an agency, provide to the community member. So our early research showed that there's issues with what the different watch and act, advice and emergency warning means. So some people see emergency warning and view that as a heads up, not as the most extreme potent level of warning. So cutting through by talking through the behaviour. So evacuate now, prepare to evacuate, stay informed, is really critical, and that's driven a lot of the work with the Queensland bushfire warnings that we've worked on with QFES since 2017.
Sure. And I guess one of the things that we sort of found as well, I guess that interstate, we've got a lot of tourists come into our area, and so they're used to different warnings. So one of the times you'll say, do this and this, and then I go, but we do this differently, and this means something different to us. How do we act in that respect? We don't understand. We're packing our bags, we're leaving with other people in Queensland, and now they're just watching, listening to warnings. So I guess did you find any, was there any, I guess, conflict in understanding from that perspective as I know that after the Royal Commission they're looking at doing a one standard across the nation, but certainly the stuff that the impact we've seen is that miscommunication from different states giving other information. Yeah,
there is. When we audited the different messages and warnings across Australia, there are different formats and approaches that are being used. Some states will have very long warnings that are structured by location and area, and others will be shorter, specific to particular areas and have multiple warnings. So I think consistency is really critical, especially for those communities that are on the border, and floods don't stop at Queensland and then restart in New South Wales. But even for councils, looking at when a community member might live in one council but travel to work in another area, and how is that being communicated, and community members have always expected that there would be a single source of communication about events, and even though they will seek information, our research says from the Bureau is a strong choice during flood events, whereas state fire and emergency services become the stronger choice in bushfire situations. They're showing the variety of channels, platforms and sources, but there still is, an expectation that the message will be given to them,
Yes.
rather than necessarily them seeking it.
Yeah, so I guess a question for me is something that always becomes very, very relevant in everyday living, but certainly in emergency events, is, I'm not going to say how do you control the media, but I guess is there any research you've done in how you can effectively use the media to your advantage more so than going against them? Is there any tips in regards to that?
Yeah, certainly. There's a couple of ideas there. One of the pieces we've observed is that agencies are very focused and have to give one message to hit all the community, and it's rarely tailored to be able to suit risk levels or appetites of different community sectors or people. But the media have the option of being able to tell a bit more of a story. And we've noticed when we did some analysis during Tropical Cyclone Marsha, so way back, that when the media were talking about risk and telling the story about, making the name up, Joe setting up his property, making sure that everything was cleaned off and secured so that, the family could weather the cyclone and rainfall. So being able to provide that visual cue but also personalise the story was important to the overall discussion and understanding of risk. So we look at risk as a feeling, but also think about how messages can reinforce or offset the feeling. We don't want people to be so paralysed by fear, but we do need to recognise that everyone will respond in different kinds of ways. So trying to find that kind of beautiful tipping point is a bit of a balance, but the media can tell different kinds of stories. And there's obviously been criticism of media being in the thick of the storm and almost being swept away, and we've seen some terrible things have happened to journalists who put themselves into that risky situation. But I think when you can model what good practice is of the community, that helps reinforce the good messages from agencies. So I think that visual piece that may not necessarily come through.
Yeah. It's always, we hear that every day in our work, is that you say this, if it's flooded, forget it sort of stuff, and then you'll see cars driving through, and media keeps showing these cars driving through, and very rarely do you ever see media put on a shot of cars stopping, either reversing or just stopping and not going through that flooded water. So, hey, look, this is someone doing a really good behaviour.
Yeah.
I guess from your perspective, is that something that we need to try and, work with media to say, hey, can you put out a more positive message, more so than just a negative? Is that, a way that we can work with media and go, okay, let's do more of this behaviour rather than that behaviour, just so, like you said, we're modelling what we want people to do rather than what we don't want them to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And we presented these findings to AFAC a few years ago, and the ABC took that on board to think about how they can engage with the community, and almost it's the shared responsibility notion that it's not just between agencies and communities, it's between all stakeholders, and the media have a really important stake and role to play with how they are sharing responsibility for community safety as well as their own safety too. And I think when you can signal that higher order ethic and moral kind of role, it can lead to good behaviour too.
Is there one, stream or type of media, whether it be television, radio, social media nowadays, is there one type of media you found that people were more openly going to, or is it, I know there's a huge rise with social media these days. Is it a case of that you found a particular medium people are using more so than others, or using as more of a trusted source than others now, or?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It varies by age. So we will see during natural hazard, when we do our surveys, people will go to television. It's a natural source because they want to see the visual side of things. Radio does have a role to play, but it's different by age group. So I think when we're wanting to engage with younger adults, thinking about the different social media platforms is critical there.
Sure.
But platforms like Twitter, which is used really by journos more so than everyday people, is probably lower on the list than other sources. But yeah, so our recommendation, given that those findings, is it's important to think about multiple channels and also, we're talking about some of the preparedness piece, but educating communities about when an emergency alert might come through and what that means. So some of our research community members don't quite understand why or how they might receive an emergency alert. And so even just going, it's not fake, it's actually sent to you because it's in this area. And there's certainly a reluctance to click on a link in a text message because we've been told not to do that in the past as well. So just trying to signal trust and an expectation around that, but also making sure that same message is available on other channels that are trusted, that people can go to first.
Yes. So as far as, I guess, cumulative with your research, if you were to give me your top tips if I'm developing messaging for my community, what would your recommendation be in those top tips for me?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first thing I would do is look for where you might be biased to use operational or technical language and flip it. Think about what a community member may or may not know and stand in their shoes and think about what you need them to do. So if you were on the phone with your mum or a good family friend, what would you want them to do? And our advice is lead with that behavioural action, whatever the more abstracted behavioural action is, and then supplement that with the specific instructions that support that behavioural cue, be it prepare, be it leaving. Make sure that's embedded within the message so that everything's contained within that one go-to piece. The other piece is to provide people with some clear sources of information where they can get further details about this. We know that even in that tipping point of an emergency, the people will actually just want to go and verify the information. So if you can embed that within the text, that's helpful. Use language that's easy to understand and shows personal relevance to the community member. And also, I think you're signalling the appropriate level of risk associated with the hazard. So we want to be able to achieve a shared understanding of the operational knowledge and expertise with the community members so that they can appreciate what they might need to understand about the bushfire, the flood, etc. And also what they might need to be thinking about into the future. To support their decisions, and locating risk to them in geographical terms, but also an understanding of where their family members might be and who they can reach out to. We'll often talk about leaning into community members or neighbours when there's time for that. Absolutely, it's important to take that approach as well. It's also important to think, while there is a strong role for the official warning that agencies will issue, there's multiple players that are communicating during a natural hazard, media, but also people on Facebook and different kinds of groups and organisations as well. So thinking about how they work together generally consistently is great, but when there is inconsistency in the messages, it can trigger concerns, misperceptions, and and in some cases lead to inappropriate behaviours that
Sure.
can put people in harm. So one of the pieces of work that we've done here is to really examine, does inconsistent information and conflicting cues exist? What's the effect of them, and how can we offset that? And the use of visuals to tell part of a broader crisis narrative is really important. So when agencies can show what the fire looks like, or show videos of what the fire looks like, and that can help offset some of the misperceptions that can arise as a result of or conflicting cues.
And is it important, I guess, for the role we use the mayor as our spokesperson? Is it important, I guess, does your research find if a person sees that consistent face, there's that level of trust, and he goes, okay, we've elected this person as our point of communication,
Yeah.
we trust this person, and like you said, the commissioner with the pips on the shoulders and things, is that, I guess, should we stick to that and just keep that one level of trusted person?
Yeah, it's a great question, especially in light of COVID and always seeing our CHO, which I feel for Victoria. You know, it's a fatiguing role when you are the constant face of instructional content, but also risk communication. We definitely do see support for a uniform, but there may not necessarily be a recognition of who the person is. I think the uniform is more powerful than the person.
Yep.
But there's sometimes less tolerance for politicians than there is for the experts on the ground. So I think it's a bit of a balancing act, which is why having multiple spokespeople for press conferences is really helpful.
Sure.
And I think it's a balance. It also would be depending on the community and who they trust, and that could be different by region as well.